Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Makowski, and joining me are my good friends and colleagues, Doug Crenshaw and Drew Gruber. Good afternoon, fellas.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
This is an august body of historians here. Doug and Drew recently collaborated on a book about the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. And so we thought we'd get together and talk a little bit about putting this together. And so, Doug, let me start with you because I know that this idea came basically as an offshoot of your book about the 7 days.
That's
and
right.
You and I had talked about, hey, we've got a 7 days book, but we need to get him to the 7 days. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, after your conversation, I realized that was true. So I started thinking about putting it together. And when I started thinking about it, I said, it'd really be good to have somebody who's really knowledgeable about Williamsburg and all down that way. And I thought of Drew immediately. So I contacted Drew to see if he might be interested because I know he's a good writer, good speaker. So I contacted Drew, and that's how it took off.
So, Drew, you get this phone call from Doug saying, hey, I've got more work that you could potentially do. How do you feel about that? How did you feel about that?
I still don't believe it happened. And I'm thankful you all asked me to do it. Writing is not my strong suit, being a product of New Jersey public schools. And it's hard to do from the front seat of the truck. So I was so appreciative of the opportunity. And doing this project reminded me, I think, of all the bad scholarship on the Lower Peninsula that has been recited time and time and time and time again. Not to say by any means that, I'm sort of the preeminent guy down on the peninsula, because that certainly belongs to other people who've been here much longer than I've been around. But revisiting this for me, having, living down here, revisiting this for me gave me a chance to wrap my mind around some primary sources that have been punted around for the last 160 years and maybe shouldn't have been.
So grappling with that historiography, something all of us as historians do, but not enough of that grappling has gone on in the past up to this point, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, specifically, there's a lot of myth and mythology about the Peninsula Campaign that I think is easy to get a chuckle at a roundtable meeting by talking about. So it was nice to dig into those source materials. And it was also really nice to revisit some of the battlefield landscapes on the Lower Peninsula that have been here that haven't really received a big or rather popular treatment. Places like Eltham's Landing and Slash Church or Hanover Tavern. So
And
now,
Lee's
go
Mill.
ahead. Okay, yeah, exactly.
Lee's Mill, yeah.
So, Drew, and I'm going to circle back to here in just a second, Doug, I promise. But Drew, you just made a comment. I want to make sure that we clarify. You said hard to do from the front seat of the truck. You've been on our podcast before, but for readers who don't know, you spend a lot of time on the road, and maybe explain why that is.
Yeah, so thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. I jumped ahead there. Not that I have an axe to grind about the Peninsula Campaign or anything. Just come on out with all my cards showing. So no, I am humbly the executive director of Civil War Trails. So I oversee a program that offers 1,400 sites or stops across 6 states. So I am one of 2 full-time people who administer all 6 states. So it's just about 200,000 square miles of program. So I listen to the podcast a lot because there's only so many things you can do in a truck. And one of those things is not writing a book. It's hard to bounce in the passenger seat as my coworker drives and try to keep thoughts together.
Well, you wrote a great book, Doug. Drew mentioned grappling with some of these primary resources that he hadn't had the chance to revisit. I know one of your very favorite things is to get into the research library at Richmond National Battlefield. You're like a kid in a candy store when you get in there. Tell me a little bit about what primary source work is like for you.
Well, people who don't know, the Richmond National Battlefield Park has a fantastic library. It's I think it's the child of Fredericksburg's library because Robert E. Lee Crick was Bob Crick's son, and he developed some of the same projects down here. But the original source material is fantastic. The secondary sources are fantastic. And if somebody's interested, all they have to do is contact the Park Service to make an appointment. They're happy to let you come there. But the original stuff is great. So I really enjoy going there. Candy store is right.
Now, you were pretty fluent on the sources and the materials you wanted to use for the 7 days. What was it like to have to kind of refresh yourself for the peninsula?
I got, I didn't know anything at all about the Battle of Hanover Courthouse, so I had to learn all about that. And some of the things I thought about Seven Pines weren't necessarily so. particularly the Fair Oaks part of the battlefield. And I've had some people, there's a guy writing a book who's that's a great take on it. And I went out and have walked the land with the reports, and it really changed what I thought about the Fair Oaks part of the battlefield. It also was a revelation to me about Longstreet and Huger's little quarrel, which you talk about in the book.
Oh my God. Now, it's interesting. You talk about getting out on the ground, talking things over with fellow historians. And to me, that's kind of, I think, the way the best history happens. But you really touch about like walking the ground. And I know that both of you have been very involved with preservation efforts because of the importance of preserving ground so that we can walk it. Doug, let me have you talk about that for a second. Then Drew, I'll circle back to you on that.
You want to talk about the preservation aspect or walking?
Yeah, and just, being out on the ground, and what can you learn about the battle from being out there?
Well, any historian worth his salt knows you can't write a book about something if you haven't walked the ground. And the interesting thing to me about the Fair Oaks portion of the Seven Pines battle is that if you really pay attention, the ground tells you the story. And people previously have written about it, not everyone, but some have written about it, and have that portion of the battlefield wrong. And when you go out there with reports and you walk the ground, you can see the elevations, you can see where the swamp was, you can see things that were crucial to the battle so you can understand it. So it's absolutely essential. Any battle, you have to walk the ground to really understand what happened.
Drew, I know for you with your work with Civil War Trails, so much of that is like get people to the ground so that they can come to these sites. Talk a little bit about that for me, please.
Yeah, so I think I love Doug's comment. And I think you can often tell when you read a Civil War book if the person hadn't actually been there. But for example, like Eltham's Landing, had it not been for local historian and researcher Bill Palmer, multiple people had Eltham's Landing in the entirely wrong spot, not even in the right portion of the county, actually. But when you go out there with the primary source material and when you talk to the locals who have farmed these fields, and if you know what you're looking for as far as material culture goes, you can do exactly what Doug just said. You can sit there and help correct the narrative. So again, I think oftentimes we need to tip our hat to the people who've been doing this work for years. But folks like Bill Palmer, you go out and walk Eltham's Landing with him, you take the official reports with you, and all of a sudden you start to realize that no, these authors before had it in the wrong spot, because it's obvious that they didn't go out there and sort of consult those. But the same thing could be said for the Battle of Williamsburg. We're lucky enough here in Williamsburg to have had a lot of the property archaeologically surveyed. So I can put you where specific regiments were with a great deal of certainty based on archaeological evidence, which is great. So it was a lot of fun to sort of revisit some of these things from a landscape perspective, as Doug put it.
Now, as we're tossing out place names and things like that, let's take a second and kind of trace out the Peninsula Campaign in broad sketches, so that if folks are listening who aren't familiar with what actually happened in that campaign, we kind of give them a sense of context and geography. Drew, let me have you start, since you handle kind of the lower peninsula stuff, and then we'll pass it off to Doug since he was the upper peninsula guy, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, that's fine with me, Doug. Does that work for you?
Maybe I should test to make sure you read each other's portions of the book and have Doug do that. No,
if I could, I would like to explain real quickly McClellan's strategy.
Okay, go ahead.
Very quickly, because it's actually a little longer story than this. But McClellan originally wanted to go by water to attack Richmond that way, cutting behind Johnston, cutting him off and beating him to Richmond. And Lincoln didn't want any part of that because he was scared to death of the 47,000 Confederates in Centerville and Manassas. He actually ended up on lower in Peninsula than he wanted to for various factors that we don't have time to go into. But he ended up down at Fort Monroe. And Johnston responded, came all the way down and headed down for the peninsula. I'm going to hand it off to Drew at that point.
Yeah, so I mean, when you talk about the geography of the place, Chris, I think, which is the point of your question, is really you have these three peninsulas in Virginia: the Northern Neck, Middle Peninsula, and the Peninsula, which is the one that has Fort Monroe at the base of it, which is 60 some odd miles from Richmond, is it? And of course, Fort Monroe is in Union hands throughout the entirety of the war, sort of a thorn in the side of the Confederates, generally speaking, because it's pretty close to their newly minted capital in Richmond. So I think, as Doug sort of alluded to before, McClellan's not a massive fan of the peninsula because he knows that there's some earthworks and fortifications down here, but nonetheless, his army gets moving around about March 17th, and with alacrity, I might say, they arrive 7 days later with 2 divisions of the Third Corps, and that sort of begats the beginning, as it were, of the Peninsula Campaign, I guess you could say.
So they start marching northward up the peninsula. Why is Williamsburg a particularly important spot in the Peninsula Campaign?
Well, I mean, just like us, the people who design the Williamsburg line, originally a guy named Benjamin Ewell, studies history. So he knows that, throughout history, even before white people got here, the section of the peninsula that we know as Williamsburg today is the narrowest. So if you look at the peninsula on a map, you'll notice that Williamsburg is where everything squeezes together. And it's also the tallest point on the peninsula down here. From a topographical perspective, it makes total sense to have a series of earthworks constructed here at Williamsburg. But when Benjamin Ewell from the college, he's a mathematics professor, starts laying out the Williamsburg line, a guy named Robert E. Lee decides he doesn't like it and sends an engineer down to change it all around. But the Williamsburg line is only constructed to be a line of defense temporarily. Both Team Gray and Team Blue are wholly aware that once the earthworks at Yorktown and Gloucester have been eclipsed or abandoned, the Williamsburg line is only there for sort of a temporary hold, because once both the York and James Rivers, which create the peninsula, are open to naval operations, the Williamsburg line is wholly untenable, which is why throughout the siege of Yorktown, McClellan has what he calls sort of his lightning brigade. Not a quote there, but essentially this group of ad hoc guys who are both supposed to launch amphibious operations and are mounted. They're ready at most times throughout the siege of Yorktown, waiting for the siege to be lifted so that the Union Army can nip on the heels of the Confederates and make Williamsburg's line mostly untenable. And then, of course, from Williamsburg all the way until the gates of Richmond, we don't really have a defensive line like Williamsburg. So the Williamsburg line is constructed because people pay attention to history and they know it's going to be an important choke point.
Having spent a little bit of time on the Southern Peninsula at the Lower Peninsula last summer, it's not like they had an I-65 that just sort of cruised up the middle of the high ground and everything was nice and covered. That's really hard terrain to cross. And I noticed there's just lots of swampiness. It's wet, it's low. So what was it like for this Union Army to try to move its massive bulk?
If I might, Chris, if I might jump in here for a second.
Yeah.
I think McClellan's original thought was he could use the York Rivers and the James Rivers to transport supplies and men. Mm-hmm. But to Drew's point, there was fortifications at Yorktown and across the river, which precluded use of the York, and the CSS Virginia appeared and precluded the use of the James. So I'll hand it back to Drew.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things for me that was amazing about doing all this is looking at both Army commanders and realizing how good they both really were. I'll just throw that out there because both readily acknowledge what is and is not possible at the Hampton line, the Yorktown line, the Williamsburg line. And by the time they get to the gates of Richmond, as Doug and I explored, not only are they handling these day-to-day operations, but they're shifting how their armies are organized. Like, it's just crazy. But thinking more specifically about this, I think both Army commanders are aware of and deal with something that I've heard historians not acknowledge at all, which is the fact that everything down here on the Lower Peninsula is tidal. So when the Vermonters launch at Dam Number 1, one of the reasons that they're going to launch in the morning is because the tide is out. I've heard people lecture about the Battle of Dam Number 1, and they're like, and all of a sudden they can't cross the river to go back. No, they were wholly aware that the second string of guys could not get across the river because the tide is going to come back up again. And of course, McClellan, to a certain extent, as we often hear, has this antiquated map of the Virginia Peninsula. It's got rivers in the wrong areas, which sort of befuddles him on D-Day +1, as it were. But almost immediately thereafter, they're aware of this. In fact, they're so critically aware of it that as both sides are rushing troops to the Virginia Peninsula throughout the siege of Yorktown, they are doing this as the tides rise and fall. So yeah, it is miasmic swamp down here, Chris. It's no fun to live here in the summertime. It's also no fun to be down here when it rains because everything floods. And then of course you get a tide on top of that too. And this brings me to an interesting point, which is however long I will study this campaign, I just have the extreme amount of appreciation for the individual soldiers and sailors who are in the trenches all day long, dealing with things like rotten shoes and pants. And it's a gross place to be. There's some days I don't even want to take tour groups out because it's full of, ticks and chiggers and the tide's up and it's swampy and I get to go home to an air-conditioned house.
Yeah, July and August are not pleasant.
No.
Well, and when I said that I spent some time there last summer, I have to admit I wasn't even down there doing Civil War stuff. I have a 5-year-old, or had a 5-year-old who's now 6, doing bush gardens. That's a much different experience on the peninsula than going through the miasmic swamps. So, Doug, Drew just tossed something out there. I got to ask you about how good both commanders really were. What do you think about that? How do you assess the performance of these two commanders?
Well, that's a big question.
Isn't it though?
I think Joe Johnston was intelligent, could read a map, and he proved that. I think he was a poor communicator with Davis, with his subordinates, and he didn't handle Seven Pines very well at all. McClellan comes off better to this point. His only major flaw that I saw was that he did not try to take Drury's bluff, because it's conceivable that the Union Navy could have sailed all the way to the docks in Richmond, not only with their guns, but also carrying troops. And Drury's bluff kept him from doing that. And the Battle of Drury's Bluff prevented the Federal Navy from going up the river. Had he sent land troops across, he probably could have taken the fort, and he could have sent Burnside up, who was in North Carolina, and just taken Richmond. But so I think that was a poor decision there. And it's kind of a myopic decision, if you will, as I'm focused on my land war, my own glory, I kind of think. But I don't have a real problem with them until we get to the 7 days.
Okay. And then the wheels come off the cart at that point.
Whole other story. Yeah. Now, yes, Drew's opinion. Drew might have a different opinion.
Well, but and Drew, you mentioned there's a whole lot of myth and mythology and legend about this, and I think a lot of that centers around these two commanders. So tell me, why should we think of these two guys beyond the popular conception of them as both being subpar?
I've only come to this, having gone through this, I've only come to this idea that I think both these guys were, or not just both of them, I think the Army's commanders, because there are multiple guys, as Doug and I explored moving around and about. I think the Army commanders themselves are a product of that place and time, right? Here we are sitting 160 years later with our libraries behind us that allow us to look at them from a really critical point of view and perspective. But when you think about the time and the place, and that's what I really love doing about this process, is I started with primary source materials. I did not start with secondary source materials, and I started reading these letters back and forth. And you have somebody like McClellan, who on, what is it, D+2. So the second day of his campaign, he only has a third of his army in front of him. He's got a bad map. He attacks a position, Lee's Mill, and it doesn't go so well. And then all of a sudden he's got people like, Erasmus Case, who's writing, and I think the quote is that no part of this line can be taken by storm. McClellan's like, that's interesting. So the next day he assigns Hancock to try to take it by storm. And then a couple days later, you've got a guy that goes up in a balloon, and he's like, this is a really big line, and it looks like there are a lot of Confederate soldiers down here. And McClellan's like, that's great, but he still tries to take yet again by storm. So throughout the entirety of even the siege of Yorktown, this guy who's been sort of branded as having the slows ignores his division commanders, his corps commanders, his primary engineer. I think Barnard says something like, it's the most magnificent line of modern times. And they keep sending sorties against the Yorktown line, even without his army being up. So if you think about somebody like McClellan, who we always say is overly cautious and he was duped by faulty intelligence, if you look at the primary source information, specifically his letters, he may still be asking for more soldiers, but he's not stopped telling his division commanders and his corps commanders to press against the Yorktown line. I think I counted something like over a dozen sorties against the line, even after the siege engines really come into being, which is amazing to me for somebody who's been typecast as being slow. Conversely, you have somebody like Magruder. I don't know how many times I've read books or articles about Magruder having his men parade back and forth to deceive the Union Army. And when that line is cited, I've followed it to the official records, and it's not there. I can't find the order. But what I can find is two comments from two soldiers, one I think 14th Louisiana and one from 14th North Carolina, where they both talked, and I think one specifically uses the word deceive about having these fires and stuff set and marching to and from, but they don't really intimate that it's they've been ordered to do it. It seems to be part of this sort of constant reinforcing of the Confederate line. But to Doug's point about archives, there is one citation that was supposed to be in the Museum of the Confederacy from Magruder to a guy named, I think, Cummings, who may be in command of some Georgians, where apparently in that letter that nobody's cited fully, it talks about him trying to maneuver guys, or Magruder trying to maneuver people to deceive them, but I can't find an order. So if you have it, please let me know. And then also please let John Corstein, myself, Michael Moore, and everybody else who's written about the peninsula know. So I think doing this for me, to go back to your question about the Army's commanders, gave me a chance to look at both Team Blue and Gray with fresh sets of eyes. I mean, people like, the First Corps who shows up at Eltham's Landing with their back to the York River, like that's kind of a pucker factor moment, but yet they don't let it stop them. So I think it's important when we write about the Civil War, when we research the Civil War, to focus on what they saw in front of them and what they knew at the moment, and not what we see and know today.
Hey, Chris, if I could jump back in.
Yeah.
No one will ever confuse me with the McClellan lover. Okay. But I want to defend him in a couple of things. The first thing is Lincoln made him leave a large amount of troops in DC to protect the capital. And the second thing is he kept most of the First Corps away from him. And these are well-known facts, but I think it's about a third of his army altogether, quarter to a third of his army he's missing, that he's counting on. So the other thing is, when he gets to Yorktown, he kind of follows a more modern doctrine. Believe it or not, we think of siege as being old-fashioned, but he wants to use metal instead of men to take Yorktown, which I commend him for. He wanted to bring up his heavy siege guns and drive the Confederates out, which he did, as opposed to sending thousands of men to their deaths. So I commend him for that. Johnston, I said he could read a map, and against Lee's wishes and Davis's wishes, he abandoned Manassas and Centerville and went down to the Rappahannock line when he saw it obvious that McClellan would use a river. And then when he came down to Yorktown, he found McClellan's heavy equipment coming up, heavy guns coming up. He backed up to Richmond, which was a good move because then he was behind the Chickahominy and McClellan was a long way from home. Rather than try to stay down there and be flanked, he was proven correct that he could be flanked by water. The Eltham's Landing proved that that could happen. So I don't love either of them, but I got to give the devils their due.
Yeah, it seems, kind of funny to me that, Johnson's reputation, and I'm no Johnson lover either, but his reputation is that he just backs up and backs up and backs up and keeps doing it and keeps doing it and keeps doing it. And you see it time and time again during the war, but we sort of forget in this particular instance that he knew that was going to happen to him, and he had no other choice. If he's outflanked by the rivers on both sides, what's he supposed to do?
He was proven correct in both counts, so there you go.
Yeah. Let me swing back to McClellan for a second, because, Drew, I think you bring up a lot of really important points for us to consider. And it's hard to look at McClellan without knowing what we know after 160 years of hindsight. And we sort of look at McClellan as the whole person and then put him back into a historical moment like this, instead of just being in that historical moment with him to begin with. And so if we put ourselves in the shoes of 1862 George McClellan, that's a different character than what we've kind of come to know over these years. And that, I think, unduly influences the way we look at, the actions that unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, I've been booed at a round table before. for talking about how tenacious McClellan was in the West Virginia campaign of 61 and the early Peninsula of 62. I don't quite understand why. But I've also had people who would be like, well, you can't give McClellan props for Williamsburg and Eltham's Landing because he wasn't even on the field. Okay. How many Army commanders do we know of who aren't actually on the field, but know their division and corps commanders well enough to put a plan into motion, right? And that's exactly what happens at Williamsburg, or for example,
That is their job.
Correct, Harper's Ferry, Antietam. But yeah, I think it's incumbent on us to look at what's in front of these guys in 1862. As Doug pointed out, he doesn't have a third of his army with him, and was it on April 4th when the Army of the Potomac surges forward to the lines at Yorktown, having left Fort Monroe, only a third of what he was going to take with him had arrived. Conversely, you got folks like Joe Johnston and Magruder on the opposite end who are waiting for folks like Gustavus Smith and Huger to show up on the field, and they're doing everything that they can to keep their guys in the ranks. I think people tend to forget at Yorktown, the original Confederate enlistment period was expiring. So you got the Army commanders on Team Gray who have this Union Army that every day seems to get a little bit bigger in front of them. And at the same time, they got colonels from regiments coming up to them and they're like, we're supposed to go home tomorrow. What do you want me to do? And that's no small task, not to mention feeding these guys and the horses. D.H. Hill has probably my favorite letter from the whole campaign. He's sitting in his position in Old Yorktown proper. And I want to say that his letter specifically comments that he has 2 guns that can reach the Union lines. And I want to say that he's got like a dozen, maybe 16 rounds of ammunition total. And then he ends his letter to his CO by saying that he has this horrible candle and he can barely see the lines he's writing on. So to think about somebody like D.H. Hill in this moment, trying to keep his brigades and divisions together as a cohesive force, is just amazing to me to think about. And then of course the guys who had to actually serve on the line. So I think
D.H. Hill is always a happy camper.
Yeah, he's like proper Eeyore. It's fascinating to me. And I mean, when you talk about something like Eltham's Landing, Franklin's division having arrived sort of the third weekish of April 1862 and working with the engineers to put up these flatboats and these big ladders so that they could in theory climb the heights at Gloucester Point to finally break the Yorktown line, finally getting off the boats, May 2nd or 3rd, when the Yorktown line just goes up in flames, and then having to rush back on the boats, but then literally sailing around the entirety of the Confederate Army. It's just one of these magnificent moments of just strategic thinking that is thought about on high, but then applied by your division commanders and your corps commanders. So it's fascinating to me to go stand in the ground and think about these things. I mean, I got lost in the engineers' report about how they lashed all the flatboats together so that they could move batteries of artillery with the limbers behind them so they could float into action. I mean, that's cool stuff. Just it sort of relights that fire for this time period.
Doug, I know one of the things that you did with primary sources is some detective work on your own, where you tracked down the spot where Joe Johnston was wounded during Seven Pines, and got some maps and some sources. Tell us a little bit about that, because I thought that was a really neat piece of original research.
You asked the question, if I remember correctly, and so I went over to the Richmond Battlefield Park, and Bobby Crick and I started looking through some stuff, and we found one of his aides' letters that said that Johnston made it to the tracks and went back 200 yards, and he was with him. So, okay, I'll take that as valid. And then we got a Google map to figure out where that might be. And we measured it out. I went out there and it's approximate 200 yards. And we went back up 9 Mile Road. And it turns out there was a house there. And Bob said, hey, this was the only house in the area up to the Adams house, which is up the street about another mile. This had to be this house. So once we found the house, the Hitchcock house, we were pretty much there. So that's how we kind of nailed it down.
And, completely unremarked and unnoticed, and, nothing there to mark its significance.
Pretty surprising, actually, because it's actually pretty clear when you go back and look. Well, there it is,
And you consider the ramifications of that shot, which changed the nature of the war because it knocks Johnson out of command. A huge moment and completely unrecognized. I thought you did great work tracking that down.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So of course I wondered, now today I think there's an old auto parts store there. I just wondered
There
why
is.
Johnson didn't take cover in the auto parts store and keep himself protected. So I want both of you to comment a little bit about Fair Oaks, Seven Pines, because after Johnson is flushed out of his position in the middle of the peninsula and he heads up to the defenses of Richmond, he doesn't stay hunkered down. He's got to look for a way to take a swing, and so Fair Oaks happens as a result. How important is that battle? Why does he launch it in the first place? How does that tie into the overall Peninsula Campaign?
It's actually pretty interesting, if I might. The battle actually was going to be fought a different way. He got word that McDowell's corps was coming down from Fredericksburg, and Lincoln actually ordered it down for a day and then turned around and ordered it back. When he got that word from Jeb Stuart, he said, well, I have to attack the units north. There were 3 federal corps north of the river and 2 corps south of the Chickahominy. And so he was going to send Gustavus Smith and A.P. Hill, who was a brand new division commander, over the river and attack, somewhat what like Lee did a month later. But he gets the word the next day that McDowell has turned around and gone back. So what he sees is south of the river, there are only 2 Union Corps. One is several miles back, and the 4th Corps is at the intersection of Seven Pines and 9 Mile Road, with 1 division advanced a mile, which anyone cares to know where that is. It's where the Sandston Library is today, if you're out there. And he sees an opportunity, and it rains heavily. It's been raining all month, and it rains really heavily. So he decides he's going to attack that division and then the corps and destroy them, and possibly even the other, and force McClellan to retreat. He has a really good plan. He's going to launch a pincher attack with Longstreet coming down one road, UG coming up another road, D.H. Hill going straight down the Williamsburg Road, and it gets totally fouled up. And so the result of the battle is really, the only result of the battle is 11,000 casualties, and then Johnston is wounded and is out, because no ground is gained at all. When Lee takes command, he pulls the troops back to their starting position. So it was a bloody disaster, really, except that Johnston was out.
Drew, how do you assess Seven Pines and Fair Oaks?
It is interesting. They're not engagements that I studied heavily before we started this process of the book. And first and foremost, the landscape up there isn't really as clear maybe as it is on other battlefields.
All developed. Yeah.
But going back to this sort of mantra of, judge the men if we need to judge them at all in the moment, I don't see an alternative other than to attack. And I think it's the right moment, albeit maybe a little out of character for him to do that. But yeah, I don't see an alternative. And of course, again, looking at the engagement today and thinking about the men who lost their lives there, we question why. But is that not the moment of sort of check where the inertia of the campaign is stopped, maybe? Mm-hmm. But again, and not to over reiterate it, but I don't, having read it now and looked at the source information from those days leading up to, and of course the subsequent conversation after, I don't see an alternative. Where else to go? What's the other cards that are in your deck?
I think Johnson had no choice. I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it was totally mismanaged, though. That was the problem.
Which really doesn't seem all that dissimilar from the way the 7 days unfold, where Lee comes up with these elaborate attack plans that seem to go afoul for various different reasons. Maybe it's just bad mojo around Richmond, I suppose.
Well, one thing to remember, and anybody who studied probably knows this, but for the newer people, the Army commanders haven't commanded armies of this size before. I mean, the Mexican War, the armies were vastly smaller. So this is new to everybody. So I give them a little bit of a pass on some of this because they haven't done it before. It takes, even Lee, as great as everyone thinks he did, he didn't do all that greatly in the 7 days, really, if you look at what happened, because you were talking about it. A lot of mismanagement and so forth, but that's a whole nother story. But here, Johnston, Longstreet didn't follow instructions as we know them, and Johnston didn't really take an active part in managing the battle. So it It was a good plan, and I agree with Drew. It's his only card he had to play.
Well, and haven't we just reorganized part of the armies too?
We did.
Right. So not only are they the largest groups we've ever seen before on a landscape, but the personalities are all brand new to you as a commander at any ilk. And I think about, not to be Jersey centric here, but I think about Philip Kearny arriving. And when Kearny gets onto the field, I mean, he's coming onto the field with not just his division, but he's seeing other brigades and divisions that aren't his. And he just is, what are you doing here? Okay, go this way. You know, or as they start to move away from that line too. I mean, Philip Kearny's, well, of course it's him, so he's just deputizing everybody as he goes around. But it's, I think, a great example of where we're in a moment where it's the largest armies we've seen. We're in a moment where there are people brand new to you. You don't know how they respond to, you know, direction and order. Can you be hands off with them? As you said before, Doug, it's your job, but do you know if they're going to stand up to their job? And then, of course, you got people running into each other and trying to figure out who belongs to whose army. And, you know, it's just pandemonium.
Staff work is abysmal. At Seven Pines, staff work is pretty bad during the 7 days. And to Drew's point, Johnston's got Magruder, who's new to him. He's got UG, who's new to him. And Lee will have even more people new to him to command. And it's difficult if you don't know these people. You got to judge them, got to let them see what they do. You know, you got to give them a try first. And they do well or they don't. And if you don't have the staff to make sure your orders are carried out, it's a problem.
And one of the things that I really found cool about this conversation is you've both talked about a process of discovery that you each went through working on different parts of this book. There were things you guys learned working on this book, which I know as a writer, I'm always delighted. You know, one of the reasons I write things is so I can learn and discover. What was that like for each of you to not just know the material, but then find things that challenged your understanding of the material?
Doug?
Okay, well, of course, Hanover Courthouse was brand new to me and wasn't even fought at Hanover Courthouse, which I found interesting. I found it fascinating because I wasn't familiar with the ground at all, and it's almost in my backyard. The other thing was Seven Pines, and particularly Fair Oaks. A guy named Vic Vignola, I'll give him some props here. He's got a book coming out from Savis, I think later this year. He's the one who took me out there and pointed some things out to me, and we started really researching. It was so exciting. You know, that's what I find exciting about this kind of work, is discovering new things and changing the way you think about things. And I think I finally understand what really happened here. I think it's just fabulous. How about you, Drew?
I worked on these 3 specific chapters, wholly focused on primary source stuff first. And then once I sort of had them like framed out with my primary source quotes in there and sort of this linear feel of how I feel like the events went down and why, I went back and I reread a couple of the secondary source information on them, and I disagreed with some of it. And I thought to myself, okay, the only reason I can stand here and disagree with some of it is because they went out on a limb and did the exact same thing 6 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. So when I sort of started writing the narrative to connect my frame on those 3 chapters, my sort of overriding thought was that, okay, I feel like I can sort of present McClellan in a different way here. And I feel like I can present Eltham's Landing in a different way here. That also tips the hat to people like Michael Moore and Bill Palmer. But when I was writing them specifically, my hope was that people would do exactly the same thing, hopefully in years to come. I want somebody to come back and find the missing Magruder order that says, please march around in circles so we confuse everybody. You know, and I want somebody to come back and be like, you know what, Doug, I think he actually got shot 200 yards in this direction. Like I wanted to use Chris's phrase from before, I wanted to add to the historiographical record without coming out and being like, I'm right. I wanted to add something that sort of suggests an alternative and hopefully inspires people to go out and see their own battlefields and explore their own battlefields, but then also come explore ours and say, did we get it right? And bring their knowledge and resources with them. So for me, the process was invigorating because I sort of felt like I was adding to a discussion, not ending one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well
Like
said.
it's the current culmination of a process, but the process is ongoing.
Right.
And as more evidence shows up and more interpretation becomes available, hopefully people can build on that. Now, you mentioned some great folks, Moore, Palmer, and one of the things I want to underscore is that To Hell or Richmond is essentially like an intro level. Here's your first blush if you want to know something about it, and then you go to guys like that who've written in depth and extensively, and but sometimes that can be a little daunting as your first exposure to something. So this is really sort of intended as that dip your toe in opportunity. So Drew, this was your first book. What was that like for you?
Frustrating, because as I mentioned, it's hard to drive or sit in a truck as you bounce. It's also hard to find inspiration in a hotel room. Just naturally not being sort of in an office environment all the time is what made it difficult. And then I think there were multiple times where, I sort of joked before about me not having writing chops, where I would have these ideas or ways to sort of thread one primary source account and a date and a time together to sort of build that narrative. But I could talk about it clearly, but then when I opened the Word document to transcribe that out, it just wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thankful for all of the other authors from the emerging series who sort of not just helped encourage me to remember that this was a 101. It wasn't supposed to be like a heavy hitting academic treatise.
Mm-hmm.
But all the other authors who had written about it, who I'd literally used their book to go out. So at a certain point, I guess to answer your question, Chris, I think I got too close to it. And I had to pull myself back and remember sort of like, this is supposed to be hello and welcome to the Battle of Williamsburg and the siege to Yorktown. It was eye-opening for me, as any first experience would be, I guess.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I can say, and I think Doug would agree, you're an excellent writer and you've got wonderful chops. And, Doug has this great conversational style. And you can tell he's out on the battlefield doing a lot of tours that comes across in the way his writing is put together. As an editor, to me, the funnest thing about editing is I can hear everyone's different voices and sort of what turns them into the writers they are based on knowing who they are as people. And I definitely see each of your personalities and backgrounds in your writing styles, which is really neat. Comes across great. So anything I haven't asked you about your book that either of you think I should have?
Ooh. That's a good question.
This is one of those things that, you might be like, oh, nope, we got it all. And then we'll finish. And you're like, oh, wait, I know what you should have asked me.
Right now, I think you've covered it, but as soon as we hang up.
I think, I don't know if necessarily you would have asked me this question, but I mentioned sort of earlier on about the Yorktown line, or rather the Williamsburg line, being created because people studied history. And it's fascinating to me when you look at the 1862 Peninsula Campaign and the subsequent actions along the peninsula in 1863 and 1864, how eerily similar they were to the British in 1815, the American Revolution in 1780 and 81, how the various choke points, the road networks, the river networks, places like Drury's Bluff, I think it's almost preconceived as to how this is going to turn out, to be honest with you, if you study history. So I would say that for me, the fascinating thing about wrapping this up, and I think we talked about it a little bit in the appendices, is how eerily similar this event is to several that come before it. So I'd be really interested to see if scholarship about the American Revolution, the campaign to Richmond in 80, subsequent campaigns around 81, maybe look at 1862 with a little bit of a different perspective.
I'll throw this out. Again, I'm not a McClellan lover, far from it, but his overall plan was good. He got to the same exact ground that Grant got to 2 years later with 50,000 less casualties. I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, there's something to think about for sure.
I've never thought about that.
I'm not knocking Grant, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. So let me wrap up, Drew, by giving you the opportunity to just sort of make a pitch for the many different sites that take advantage of the Civil War Trails network that you brought into this book, because I think if people follow this book, they're going to see a lot of really cool off the beaten path places, a lot of things that really tie into that network, and also some great hospitality. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so geez, we didn't even get into the naval operations. Of course, we talked about a peninsula which is bounded by water, right? But we didn't talk about Burnside's campaign. We didn't talk about the iron boats.
Right.
We talked a little bit about Drury's Bluff. But armed with this book in your hand, you can explore coastal Virginia. I think we have something to the tune of like 60 Civil War trail sites in coastal Virginia. Almost 24 of them are about the campaign. There's a Civil War Trails site for the sinking of the Congress and the Cumberland, and of course the Virginia action, or rather the Monitor and Merrimack, however you want to name the boat. And then of course along the way you'll find places like Ironclad Distillery, which is phenomenal. Stewart's Ride around McClellan will get you places. For example, a Civil War Trail sign is at New Kent Winery, which is an excellent place to stop and realize that Stewart's guys were getting drunk along their ride too. Maybe yours as well. But going back to Doug's point, there's such power in place. There's incredible power in place. So if you read the chapter on Eltham's Landing and you think to yourself, man, I'd really like to go visit it, there are 2 Civil War Trail signs waiting for you. And probably my favorite site of the Peninsula Campaign is that second Civil War Trails site at Eltham's Landing. And it is a moment. You have these 3 Union brigades with their back to the York River, having now been pushed back to this little tiny beachhead by what is almost a division under Whiting of Confederate soldiers, and they're sitting in this wood line. And the Union soldiers have a couple cannon around them, and just one Confederate flag after another just appears in this wood line across this field, and you can stand at the Civil War Trail sign, and it's like pucker factor level 10. And that's the power of being able to take a book and go out and stand at a place like, the Civil War Trail sign at Eltham's Landing. So, get out and explore, go see these sites, go visit, Young's Mill and Lee's Mill and Dam Number 1. The Wynn's Mill line of earthworks at Newport News Park are absolutely incredible. They are the most intricate I've ever seen and the largest I've ever seen. So go out and explore. That's my takeaway.
Very good. The book is called To Hell or Richmond, the 1862 Peninsula Campaign. And then if you get up the peninsula and you get yourselves to Richmond, you can then follow up with Doug's book, Richmond Shall Not Be Given Up, the 7 Days Battle. I keep wanting to say a guide too. There's guide stuff worked into them, but these aren't particularly guide books necessarily. To Hell or Richmond, Richmond Shall Not Be Given Up. Doug Crenshaw, Drew Gruber, thank you both so much for spending some time with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris.
And for all of our friends here at Emerging Civil War, I'm Chris Mikowski. We will see you online and on the battlefield.